All right. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. As always, I am your host, Will Burns, and I serve as co-director of the Institute. In terms of setting the table for today's episode, a lot of our assessment of the potential impacts of carbon removal at a very large scale, whether it be positive or negative, focuses on the potential implications for human beings and human institutions. Including things like energy requirements, for example, and water requirements. And while that's certainly important research, in my opinion, equally important is assessing the potential impact that large-scale interventions could have in the context of biodiversity. And to date, there has been a relatively small amount and non-granular amount of that analysis, in my opinion. And so I was extremely happy to see a new report that was published in the journal Nature Climate Change entitled Biodiversity Implications of Land-Intensive Carbon Dioxide Removal. And we are fortunate today to have the lead author on that report, Ruben Prütz, who serves in the geography department at Humboldt University in Berlin and is also affiliated with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And as always, Dr. Prütz will provide an initial intervention and summarize the results of this study. We'll then proceed to a couple of seating questions on my part, and then we'll proceed to audience questions. And so, in that latter context, I encourage everyone to start populating the Q&A when questions arise during the presentation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Prütz.
Great. Thank you, Will. Let me first pull up my slides. All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Will. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present here in this webinar series. And as you already mentioned, I want to talk about one of our recent studies, which we published in the journal Nature Climate Change. And this work was conducted by a large group of people from different backgrounds. We had several colleagues from the modeling side, but then we also worked with colleagues which are more on the ecology side, so really spanning a spectrum of academic backgrounds. And yeah, before I dive into the actual study, I thought it would be good to start with some terms and concepts. I think frequent listeners of the Scrubbing the Skies webinar series will be familiar with some of these terms and concepts, but I think it doesn't hurt to go over them again. So a central focus of our work was assessing mitigation scenarios. What are mitigation scenarios? These are internally consistent future pathways which outline how, across different sectors, emission reductions or also the absence of emission reductions may affect the climate. It's important to note that these scenarios are not predictions or forecasts of the future. They should be more understood as internally consistent imaginations of how we could achieve ambitious climate targets. And these scenarios, at least the scenarios that we assessed in our study, are produced by so-called integrated assessment models, IAMs. And what are these IAMs? These are large computer models which connect different system components, such as or having like a representation of our economy, the energy sector, land use change dynamics, and then also feedbacks with the climate. And when designing scenarios, IAMs can make use of a large toolbox of different tools or strategies that allow us to reduce emissions, to decarbonize our economy. And one tool in this toolbox is carbon dioxide removal, the key concept of this webinar series, and I'm sure most people will be familiar with, but basically carbon dioxide removal, CDR, comprises all human activities which actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere and then durably store the CO2 elsewhere, such as geological formations or in carbon pools, which are not the atmosphere. There are many different approaches that could potentially allow us to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at scale. And in this study, we focus on two land-intensive options. The first option I refer to as forestation. This includes afforestation, reforestation, and natural restoration. These are three different options, but basically they have in common that they aim to increase forest cover and thereby increasing the CO2 sequestration in biomass, basically in trees, but also in soils. And then the second option that we focused on in our study is called BECCS, which stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And in this option, the assumption is that biomass would be sourced for energy production. During the energy production process, CO2 is being released, but before the released CO2 enters the atmosphere, we could capture it and then store it permanently in geological formations. So much about key concepts and terms. Now I want to move on and give you some more context so you can understand why we were motivated to do the study that I'm talking about today. And this context or the background is based on the latest IPCC report, the synthesis report on climate change, which was published in 2023. And this report clearly establishes or emphasizes that we will need some level of carbon dioxide removal. So some level of carbon dioxide removal will be unavoidable. This is on the one hand to compensate for emissions from hard to abate sectors, but more and more likely this will also be necessary to compensate for temporary temperature overshoot. And we know this with high confidence from this report. Also, the scenarios that underlie this report, they quite heavily rely on the two CDR options, which are already introduced, basically afforestation and reforestation on the one hand, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage on the other hand. So quite some reliance in the scenarios on these two options. And then lastly, what this report also emphasizes is that these very CDR options, which we require to achieve our climate targets, they may also adversely affect biodiversity if implemented poorly, and we also know this with high confidence. So in light of this, the need for CDR, the reliance on land-intensive options, and the knowledge that these options may negatively affect biodiversity, we thought it would be good to more closely look at existing scenarios and to assess them concerning their CDR-related implications for areas of high biodiversity importance. Now I want to go over to the study approach to give you a better idea of what we actually did before presenting some results. I won't go too much into the technicalities of our approach. I basically just want to outline and give you an overview of the different data sets that we used. And basically in the study, we made use of two groups of data sets. On the one hand, we made use of spatially explicit scenario data. And the scenario data can tell us something about when, where, and how much CDR would be needed to achieve ambitious climate targets. And then combining this spatially explicit information with the second group of data sets, which comprises information on biodiversity, combining these two different groups allows us to look at the spatial overlap and then from this overlap infer something about the CDR-related implications for biodiversity. More specifically about the different data sets concerning biodiversity, there are many different indicators in the scientific literature, many different metrics that allow us to assess different aspects of ecosystem integrity, about biodiversity or biodiversity loss. And in this study, we focus on two metrics for biodiversity. One of the metrics comprises climate refugia maps. These climate refugia maps come from colleagues from the University of East Anglia, and these refugia maps, they basically show us the climatic suitability of a very large ensemble of terrestrial species. So in this ensemble, we consider roughly 135,000 different species across different taxa, including plants, fungi, vertebrates, and invertebrates. And these refugia maps are then resolved for different warming levels. So that means that for each warming level between 1 degree of warming and 4.5 degree of warming, we can determine which areas globally would still be climatically suitable or become climatically unsuitable for our species ensemble. So in other words, these climate refugia areas are basically an indicator of resiliency. And we then complement this resiliency indicator for biodiversity with biodiversity hotspots. Regarding biodiversity hotspots, we follow the definition of hotspots by the IPCC. And basically biodiversity hotspots, they show us areas of exceptional species richness and also very high levels of rare species or exceptional levels of endemism. So basically, these are the two biodiversity-related indicators that we consider. One is a resiliency indicator, one is a richness indicator. And then we combine this biodiversity-related information with the scenario or CDR-related information. Regarding the scenarios, we make use of data from the AR6 scenarios database. This database stores the different scenarios that were assessed by the IPCC in the latest assessment cycle. And from this database, we retrieve basically global warming levels and CDR deployment rates for different scenarios. In terms of scenarios, we focus on the SSP, RCP scenarios. These are widely used scenarios which combine the shared socioeconomic pathways, so pathways that outline how the world may develop in the future socioeconomically, for example, shifting towards increased sustainability, for example, progressing historical trends, or what we potentially see more at the moment, shifting more towards regional rivalry. And these socioeconomic pathways can then be combined with the representative concentration pathways, which tell us something about the ambition of climate action. And with these scenarios, we can then sort of map out the space between climate action, which is in line with current policies, up to highly ambitious mitigation scenarios, which are compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees of warming. And for the same set of scenarios, we also have land use maps. And these land use maps, they show us deforestation and bioenergy cropland areas. And this information comes from 5 different widely used land use models. So much about the different data sets and our study approach. I won't go more into detail here and rather want to move on to present you some of the results, some of the findings of our study. And I want to start with the global picture. What you can see here in panel A of this plot is you can see the share of remaining refugia. So the refugia area that would still be climatically suitable for a certain scenario and certain warming level. And we can see how much of this remaining refugia would be allocated for CDR. In the left column, you see the land allocation for forestation. In the right column, you see the allocation for BECCS. And in the different rows, you see the results for 3 of the 5 considered models. And just from looking at this plot, you can see that there's quite some substantial land allocation for CDR within remaining refugia. For forestation, on the upper end, we see around 11% of refugia being allocated for CDR deployment, while for BECCS, the allocation is a bit lower, but still around 4% of remaining refugia would be allocated for BECCS. We also see that there are quite some differences between the different scenarios that we considered. So the two blue scenarios, which are the more ambitious scenarios, they show higher levels of land allocation within remaining refugia. This is simply because since they are more ambitious in terms of climate action, they more heavily rely on carbon dioxide removal, and therefore we also see higher shares of land allocation within remaining refugia compared to a scenario which is more in line with current policies. What we also did as part of this global analysis is we also compared different world regions in terms of CDR-related land allocation. What you can see in panel B here is the results for forestation again, and here we now distinguish between land allocation in remaining refugia in non-Annex 1 countries. Non-Annex 1 countries are mainly non-high income countries. And on the other hand, we have Annex 1 countries, which are mainly high income countries. And again, just from looking at this plot, we can see that there's quite substantial land allocation in non-high income countries, which raises questions of fairness and burden sharing, given that many of these non-high income countries have only limited responsibility for causing climate change, and according to these scenarios, would also bear quite some of the burden of land-intensive CDR deployment. So far, I've mainly talked about the land-related CDR implications for biodiversity. However, it's important to acknowledge that, of course, CDR would also have warming implications, simply because we deploy CDR to limit peak warming and also to constrain overshoot. And we also know that global warming or overshoot has implications for biodiversity. So what you can see in panel C here is sort of the net effect on remaining refugia. So the net effect of land-intensive CDR. And net effect here is determined by looking at the avoided warming effect of CDR. So avoided warming would be, of course, positive. And then we subtract the land allocation, which we assume to be negative in this case. And from looking at this plot, you can see that in the ideal case, CDR, land-intensive CDR, could reduce biodiversity loss or climate refugia loss quite a bit. On the upper end, around 15% of refugia loss could be avoided. However, what we can also see from looking at this plot is there's quite some uncertainty. You see this large spread of potential results going either positive or negative. And this large uncertainty stems from different assumptions about refugia's ability to recover from overshoot, so to recover from high warming levels. There's still quite some uncertainty. We don't really know how biodiversity would respond in the context of overshoot. If we assume that there's quite some ability to recover, then CDR may prove to be quite effective for biodiversity conservation. If there's only limited ability to recover, then we would see much more limited benefits from CDR deployment for constraining climate refugia loss. Now, moving on to the regional picture. So here in this figure, you can see the spatially explicit land allocation, again, for 3 of the 5 models that we consider. You see in gray the remaining refugia areas, and in color you can see land allocation for forestation and for BECCS. And for both of these options, we assume that for each 3 gigatons of CO2 would be removed on an annual basis. So 3 gigatons, this is still a sort of moderate removal level, given that many of the scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 more heavily deploy or more heavily rely on CDR, sometimes assuming double-digit removals annually. What we can see is that there's quite some substantial land allocation already at these moderate removal levels. this becomes even more apparent if we look at the results aggregated to the country level, which you can see here in the right column. And then here we can see that in several countries, more or around 20% of the remaining climate refugia would be allocated for forestation or BECCS. However, what we can also see is that there are quite some differences between the models. So we see that the land allocation patterns of these three models differ quite substantially. And in order to better understand where the models differ, or more specifically, where the models also agree in terms of CDR-related land allocation, we also looked into model consensus and explored the deployment context within areas of model consensus, model agreement. This is what you can see in this map. So here in this map, you can see, first of all, in gray, remaining climate refugia areas. And then in color, you can see where at least 2 out of the 5 models that we consider agree on allocating land for forestation. So the 5 considered models you see here at the bottom, they are AIM, GCAM, CLOBIME, Image and Remind MAGPIE, 5 widely used integrated assessment modeling frameworks, and at least 2 out of 5 of these modeling frameworks need to agree to be considered here for model consensus. And then in terms of model consensus, we distinguish between potentially beneficial agreement areas and likely harmful agreement areas. You see in orange that there are some areas where models agree to deploy or allocate land for forestation in areas where this might be beneficial for biodiversity from an ecosystem perspective. However, we also see several areas that light up in red color, which means that these areas are unsuitable from an ecosystem perspective. And this becomes even more striking if we look at the results not for forestation, but for BECCS, which you can see in this map here, where we see that even more areas light up in red, meaning there's even more model consensus for allocating land for BECCS in areas which are considered unsuitable from an ecosystem perspective. So far I have largely talked about how CDR deployment may affect biodiversity conservation. However, we can also take the reverse perspective and ask how efforts to conserve biodiversity may limit our ability to do carbon dioxide removal. And in order to understand this or to explore this, we looked at the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. What is this framework? This can kind of be understood as the Paris Agreement for nature, the Paris Agreement for biodiversity. And one of the targets of this biodiversity framework is it to bring the loss of areas of high biodiversity importance close to zero. So no land use change in areas of high biodiversity importance. However, what this framework does not clearly define is what areas of high biodiversity importance are. So in order to explore this and to mimic such areas of high biodiversity importance, we worked with different criteria, which you can see in the 3 columns here. So to represent areas of high biodiversity importance, we, for example, assumed no CDR within current biodiversity hotspots or no CDR within remaining climate refugia areas, or sort of a combination of biodiversity hotspots and climate refugia. And just to illustrate this, so if we assume that there would be or no CDR could be allocated in current biodiversity hotspots, we see then that more than 50% of the land that scenarios allocate for CDR deployment would not be available for CDR from 2050 onwards. We also see that this potential issue may arise already relatively early, as we can see that already in 2030, for 2 of the 3 criteria that we tested, more than 40% of the land for CDR would not be available. Here, it's important to note that this does not necessarily mean that we cannot achieve the removal levels that we see in scenarios. this basically just means that CDR would need to take place elsewhere. So would need to be shifted to other locations, or we have to could also deploy other less land intensive CDR options, such as, for example, direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. Or it could also mean that we have to push harder on other ends, for example, more on the demand side, where we would have to change our behavior, for example, concerning diets, where diet changes could help us to reduce the land foot pressure here. So this already brings me to the end of the results, the results that I wanted to present here as part of this series. But before I hand back over to Will, I want to end with some take-home messages and quickly wrap up what I just presented. So what I showed you in this global analysis was that from our scenario analysis, we see that there's quite some substantial overlap between CDR and climate refugia. For forestation, we see that on the upper end, around 11% of remaining refugia would be allocated. For BECCS, this is a bit more moderate, but still around 4% of remaining refugia would be allocated for BECCS in the assessed scenarios, which are compatible with 1.5 degrees of warming. At a global level, we can also see that there are quite some differences between country groups, and we can see that there's markedly higher land allocation within remaining climate refugia in non-high income countries, which raises questions of fairness and burden sharing, given that these or many of non-high income countries have only very limited responsibility for causing climate change, would likely bear many of the climate impacts, and according to these scenarios would also bear the cost or potentially the burden of land-intensive carbon dioxide removal. However, while these results may seem predominantly negative, I think it's also very important to stress that our analysis shows that CDR deployment may actually be also could potentially be also be quite beneficial for biodiversity, depending on how we implement this. And reason to this conclusion is that we can see that scenario-based CDR may potentially reduce the warming-related loss of refugia. In the ideal case, up to 25% of remaining refugia could be preserved through reduced warming-related loss due to CDR. However, it's important to note that these estimates are quite uncertain and very much depend on assumptions about refugia's ability to recover from overshoot. This is still a very much ongoing, like a frontier of very much dynamic research still. So there's definitely a need for further scrutiny to better understand what we could expect in terms of reducing warming-related refugia loss. What I also showed you is that if we exclude certain areas to be in line with the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework, we can see that more than 50% of scenario-based land for forestation or BECCS could potentially become unavailable when we exclude biodiversity hotspots. What our analysis also showed is that there are quite some differences in the land allocation fingerprints of the 5 different models, but also some agreement. So areas where there's model consensus on land allocation. And these consensus areas, they require particular policy attention, especially because many of these areas fall into places. So many of these agreement areas fall into places where CDR is expected to be negative for biodiversity from an ecosystem perspective. However, what's also important to note is that depending on how we implement CDR, for example, if we were to prioritize restoration, we could also avoid many of these negative implications and ideally lead or foster direct co-benefits in terms of, for example, reconnecting habitats, or generally supporting the persistence of refugia. With that, I want to come to an end. And as a last note, I want to emphasize that this analysis can hopefully inform future modeling in generating scenarios that are more sensitive to biodiversity conservation. I think IAMs are highly important tools that allow us to envision ambitious climate action in an internally consistent manner. So this analysis is by no means intended to just criticize IAMs, but I think hopefully this analysis could bring us closer to scenarios that look at the climate, but also have a more clearer picture on how our actions may affect other sustainability aspects, such as biodiversity. With that, I want to close and hand back to Will, and then I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions. With that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Ruben. That was a great summary of your study and a good place for us to proceed into some discussion. So again, at the outset, I'd like to remind everybody, please populate the Q&A box with your questions, and I will move to those questions after a couple of initial ones of my own. So couple of things that I'm interested in. Uh, you talked about the fact that your focus here was on afforestation, reforestation, and BECS, and that results could change if we started incorporating other CDR approaches in there. Have have you done any of that sort of preliminary research, or if not, if intuitively, do you sense that those approaches might reduce the potential biodiversity impacts, or is it just too speculative to know at this point?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think what's important to emphasize is that the scenarios that we assess, they are from the original quantification of the SSPs. So these are really widely used scenarios, but they have existed already for several years, meaning
Right,
that in the meantime, newer scenarios have been produced by the IM community, and some of the newer scenarios, they are more sensitive to biodiversity. So for example, they started to, this is still nascent, this is important to emphasize, but some of the newer scenarios, they look already more closely into how biodiversity may be affected. But I think also importantly is that these newer scenarios partly model wider portfolios of CDR options. So
hmm
in our scenarios, we mainly saw like the two dominant options, as I mentioned, are forestation and BECS.
right,
Newer scenarios, they include more direct air capture, partly also enhanced weathering. So basically options that are less land intensive. And I think generally then the answer to your question is yes, I think wider portfolios allow us to reduce the land footprint and thereby potentially reduce negative biodiversity implications. However, I think it's also important to note that some of these newer CDR options or like CDR options that have more recently been integrated into modeling, they are not silver bullets either. All different CDR options have different strengths and different weaknesses. They differ
right.
in terms of costs, side effects, and durability. And therefore, I think one thing that is quite clear already is that we will need a portfolio of different options that allow us, hopefully, to balance the different trade-offs that these options all have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? There's almost no discussion I've had, right, where there wasn't a powerful rationale for diversification of options, right? And I think this would be another one, if nothing else, for a hedge for kind of the uncertainties, I think, of biodiversity impacts for some of the approaches, like the marine ones, for example, where I spend a lot of time with. So that's interesting. Okay, another question. Uh, So you talk about afforestation and reforestation and BECS to some degree in terms of the land use impacts, and it seems like there's a per se sort of conclusion that those approaches if you increase afforestation and reforestation, for example, it has a negative impact on biodiversity, right? But of course, in a lot of cases, if you're using uh, uh, locally appropriate species and you've got some diversification, right, it can be conducive, right, to providing ecosystems for species. So how is that assessment made in your modeling, right? Where areas that putting trees, especially where they existed before, might actually be beneficial from a biodiversity perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's totally right that it's not per se that land-intensive CDR will be negative for biodiversity. This depends on many factors. Two important factors are, first of all, site selection. So there are certain areas where CDR will most likely be negative, and this is something that we consider. Why would it be most likely negative? This would be the case in areas of, for example, in areas where historically there has never been forests. So, for example, grasslands, savannas, they are just not considered suitable from an ecosystem perspective for afforestation. However, there may be other areas, such as degraded areas or degraded ecosystems, or also abandoned cropland, where reforestation may come without negative effects or even with co-benefits for biodiversity. So just to give an example that site selection matters. However, it's not only the site selection, but it's also sort of the mode of implementation.
Hmm.
So let's assume we find a site that is in principle suitable. It still makes quite a difference whether we work with locally adapted, diverse native tree species for forestation, or whether we work with monocultures, which would most likely have negative impacts.
Hmm.
So, in other words, site selection and mode of implementation matter. And we try to play around with this in this analysis by first starting with a precautionary approach where we assume that CDR may be negative for biodiversity and flagging areas that where we see agreement, model land allocation to ensure that these areas reserve further scrutiny. But then we also provide a more nuanced assessment where we distinguish between areas which could potentially be suitable if the mode of implementation is right, and areas which are likely unsuitable simply because from an ecosystem perspective, areas may not be suitable for CDR deployment in the case of forest areas which have never been forest land.
Great. All right, that's very helpful. All right, I'm going to move to questions from our audience. First question from pardon me if I mangle your name, John Hoffmeyer. It seems that the focus was mostly on CDR through afforestation. Did you consider eradication of alien invasive species such as black wattle for synthesis of biochar to accelerate rangeland restoration and improve stream flows and catchments and I guess in general improve recovery of biodiversity?
So the way we assess forestation in our analysis is by looking at the increase in forest cover. This is really like a broad brush approach, but it's important to emphasize that we don't produce new scenarios, but we assess existing scenarios. And these
Hmm.
existing scenarios, they are to some degree limited in terms of the level of detail they can provide. So we can
Right.
not clearly distinguish between different species, like forestation species, for example. So I agree. I think this would be definitely something that should get more attention. Um, and like in more generally, I think like our approach is really like a broad brush approach, which can provide a first order estimate, but really to determine effects in a very location, we need more refined um, locally refined analyses, which can then um, draw more robust or more location specific findings. Um, Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think that's salutary in itself, right? To start getting policymakers to be thinking about how they may have to do that, right? And it's daunting, obviously, right? But so much of this is. So, all right. Um,
exactly. Just like one more
yeah,
comment on this. I think
yeah,
you're completely right. This is to bring this to the attention of policymakers to identify areas which require further scrutiny. But I think this is also something where the modeling community can like improve by
right.
refining the assessment of different tree species, also reporting the information that is required for such post scenario assessments as we did in our study. I think some good progress has already been made in recent years, but I think there's definitely a potential for further improving on this end in order to facilitate more nuanced and more detailed assessments of biodiversity implications.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, and I think it would behoove us to try to scaffold some of that, even if we're ultimately not making these decisions for a decade or more, right? We're gonna need a lot of work in the interim, and now would be the time to start doing that, I think, right? Because we're gonna need huge amounts of multi-spatial sort of planning and discussion of trade-offs and things like that, right? At some point, right? And we need the data. So
Yeah.
that's a good shout out for that, Ruben. All right, next question. In your scenarios, were you accounting for carbon removal in agricultural lands via agroforestry, i.e., given the net economic benefits of adding trees to agricultural land, a significant share of forest-based CDR may be doable using existing agricultural land?
Yeah, this question goes into a similar direction as the previous question, where I have to say that our ability to really distinguish between different forestation types is challenging given the limited granularity of the scenario data that we have at hand. So while the variable forestation comprises the different subgroups: afforestation, reforestation, natural restoration, or agroforestry, it's not always possible to clearly distinguish between these options. Therefore, we also take the precautionary approach in our analysis. However, to some extent, we can disentangle this, and we do this by looking at areas which are suitable for reforestation and distinguishing these areas from areas which have never been forest land. And
Mhm.
however, I also have to say that the data that we use for this are sort of on the lower end of what is considered feasible for reforestation, again, to be more on the precautionary side. Um, and so to answer the question specifically, I think, yeah, some forestation could occur in abandoned cropland, but then again, it very much depends on how this is being done on the ground to really determine um, location specifically, whether this will be more on the positive or more on the negative side from a biodiversity standpoint.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next question is from John Fitzgerald. Did your reforestation and afforestation exclude exotic or invasive species in favor of native species of plants, even if these natives are moving away from the equator with warming?
So I want to say I want to say no, because like the models generally tend to, if possible, focus on expanding locally um, adapted tree species. However, I have to stress that we are working with existing scenarios, and we have not like produced these scenarios ourselves. So um, I can't really answer this in detail. I would have to look at the primary data of the scenarios that we used. And here, I think it's also important to note that these different scenarios from the 5 different modeling frameworks, they also differ a bit in terms of how they represent scenarios and how they represent the CDR options. Therefore, I think the strength of this multi-model comparison is also to sort of map out results for a spectrum of different approaches of climate action, or like a spectrum of approaches for implementing these two CDR options.
All right. Next question. I think this is something we've kind of spoken a bit about already, but maybe you'll expand on. It's from Julia Zigan. Do you see ways to complement your global model-based analysis with empirical case studies at the project level in order to better capture local ecological and social dynamics?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely uh, an important reflection. I think we would need this. I'm not really a researcher that has done any field work, so I don't know how exactly one would approach that. But I think what our analysis can do is really pinpoint areas that require further scrutiny. So I think the
Mhm.
areas of model agreement are a good starting point for potentially identifying sites for then more localized case studies. But I think this is absolutely necessary to complement these sort of top-down modeling approaches with more bottom-up analyses to really understand um, what biodiversity implications may look like. And I think in general, we also, in our analysis, refrained from really quantifying impacts.
Mhm.
We're more like indicating likely harmful or potentially beneficial to sort of indicate the effect direction. But I think to really determine the impacts, one would pursue such approaches as suggested in the question, really go for such bottom-up approaches.
Okay. All right. We have a question that if somebody else hadn't raised, I would raise, which is something we talked about before we came on air, which is the role of the biodiversity institutions, right? Whether it be at the national level or the international level, right? And so we had the Convention on Biological Diversity in the last decade being quite kinetic when it came to looking at CDR, right? And they passed a resolution on ocean iron fertilization and then expanded it to biodiversity, I mean, geoengineering more broadly, published some really good, pretty granular studies for the time, and then, in my opinion, seem to have disappeared when it comes to this issue, despite the fact that it didn't go away, right? That somebody should be asking questions and seeking to regulate potential impacts of carbon removal in terms of biodiversity impacts. So the question here is, to what extent uh, did you find existing agreements such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Article 8 duty to restore degraded ecosystems, or wildlife agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and its recovery plan for endangered species, to understand and already be helpful or at least ready to incorporate your findings in their work?
Yeah. So, like, as I mentioned during the presentation, in terms of biodiversity conservation policy, we are focused on the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. I haven't looked deeply into um, other frameworks or other agreements, but I think like having this relatively recent Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework is really helpful for establishing targets and a mission as like reflected in this target one, which we also incorporated in our study. More from the less from the policy, but more from the science side of things. My impression is that within the modeling community, there's more and more like a reflection and a recognition that mainstreaming biodiversity implications into scenario is really important to ensure that the scenarios or the plans that we outline for achieving ambitious climate targets do not harm biodiversity. So I think on that end, there's definitely progress being made. Um, but yeah, I think it's still a long way certainly. And yeah.
Okay. All right. Next question from Chris Farley, who I think it's U.S. Forestry Service. Uh, he suggests that afforestation professionals already consider things like species type, site characteristics in terms of determining optimal places for afforestation and reforestation. And he contends that the bigger issue is not whether we can or should do this, but how to create the policy signals and macroeconomic incentives to enable this work on the ground. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I would say that that is reasonable. So I think, as I said before, such modeling studies or like scenarios which we assess in our study, they are really good at envisioning a long-term path to provide an internally consistent picture of how we could achieve a certain policy outcome. However, this is really just a starting point, and then when it comes to implementation on the ground, we can follow such pathways. But of course, these global pathways, simply because they are so broad brush, they lack granularity. And so I would say this is, yeah, I think this reflection is definitely not in disagreement with what we say, but rather complementary.
Okay. So another question. One of the things you said, which I think is a really important question and an extremely difficult question, right? Which is the question of trade-offs and risk assessment, right? When it comes to carbon removal and things like biodiversity, right? Whereas I think you suggested in your presentation, the vector might go either way, right? So one of the big arguments in favor of carbon removal is often that one of the gravest long-term threat to species, of course, is increased warming and flooding and all the other manifestations of climate change, right? And so to the extent that carbon removal can help us prevent crossing those critical thresholds, or as I think you suggested in your presentation, pull temperatures back below in an overshoot scenario, right? And avoid maybe passing some other nonlinear sort of thresholds that have implications for humans, but also implications for wildlife. But how how sophisticated are our models at this point to be able to engage in that kind of risk sort of assessment? And if they're not fit for purpose, what do you think we need to do to get there, right? It seems like there may be places where we can simply say we shouldn't be, we shouldn't do afforestation, reforestation at this scale, given the biodiversity implications. But then if you factor in the implications of warming, maybe we end up less precautionary, right? But how do we make those kind of determinations? Do you think we'll ever have the data to be able to do that, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I'm glad that you're asking this because this gives me the chance to really emphasize that if you care about biodiversity conservation, what you should do is really focus on cutting emissions as deeply and as rapidly as possible in the near term, because this really is our best chance to limit biodiversity loss and to achieve ambitious climate targets. And cutting emissions deeply and rapidly is not only good concerning the warming implications, but it also limits our future reliance on land-intensive carbon dioxide removal. And if we limit this reliance on carbon dioxide removal, we also get, let's say, wiggle room or flexibility to deploy the CDR that we still need to do to compensate for remaining emissions, while acknowledging that this has to be really preserved for critical needs. Um, Still, this gives us flexibility to deploy CDR in areas where we expect to see less of the harms and potentially more of the potential co-benefits for biodiversity. Now, specifically regarding your question about overshoot, um, overshoot, especially in such an integrated framework, looking both at warming-related implications and land-related implications. This is really still an area of very active research where
Right.
relatively few scientific articles have been published so far. However, this is definitely high on the research agenda of different communities, and I expect that we see quite some progress in this domain in the coming years, especially in the light of soon entering a world where we are above 1.5.
Right.
So
Right.
this is definitely a priority for sure. Um, but yeah, I can only re-emphasize that by no means CDR can be used as an argument to uh, to yeah to do something about biodiversity conservation if you don't actively reduce emissions as deeply and as rapidly as possible in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really, really important research, right? Right. With that caveat, right, that we don't want it to necessarily we don't want the fear of the impacts of biodiversity loss to necessarily drive us to think that carbon removal is the only answer, right? Not that you're saying that, or that we couldn't more aggressively decarbonize to also address it, right? It's not a Manichaean sort of choice, right? But it is a trade-off. I think that needs to be acknowledged more and definitely needs more research. So it'll be interesting to see what we get. We have so many things we need to do, unfortunately, right? Costly, resource intensive, but there we
Totally,
go.
totally.
So this is less of a question. Well, I guess it's a question, but more of an encouragement. The question again relates to CBD, right? And the fact that the CBD secretariat and its subsidiary body and parties can probably do more to include greenhouse gas removal in ecosystem restoration efforts, right? The question was, will you and your co-authors or institutions seek resources to allow them to teach these actors the lessons of your research? I think that's a good general question. Do you contemplate trying to socialize this in key institutions, right? It's always a question I have for academics.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I totally agree that doing the research is one thing, but then speaking about the research and communicating the implications is probably equally important. Um, So specifically for this study, we haven't really reached out to policymakers actively, but generally, I can say that across the different institutions are, that institutions that I've been involved with or co-authors of this paper are involved with, there are channels to communicate results to policymakers, let's say at EU level or at the level of COPs. Um, so there's definitely something along these lines already being pursued by scientists, but allow me this comment that policymakers also have to listen then, and I think there's definitely room for improvement.
Yeah. All right. I think that is a good place to conclude. We have reached the top of the clock. Once again, I really want to thank you, Ruben, for summarizing this study, kind of stimulating thought about what a future research agenda in this context looks like, also, and to remind people about how important it is to not only consider humans in this calculus, but the rest of the living beings that we occupy Earth with. So, thank you once again. Thank you to the audience for your very thoughtful questions. We will be back in April with another episode. Please look for it in all of the places that we normally publicize that. And with that, I will say thank you very much and goodbye now.